The forest was always quiet at sunrise, just the way Eli liked it. Crisp pine-scented air filled his lungs as he stepped onto the frost-covered trail behind his cabin, axe slung over his shoulder, boots crunching softly against brittle leaves. He had been cutting wood in this forest every morning for nearly 15 years, ever since he'd left the bustling town behind after his wife's passing. Out here, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt honest. Eli was a man of few words and many thoughts. His days followed a steady rhythm: rise before dawn, light the fire, take coffee in a tin cup, then trek to the same patch of forest to gather wood for warmth and trade. He worked with slow precision, his movements shaped more by instinct than routine. But one particular morning, something felt different. He felt it before he saw it, a presence. The hairs on his arms rose beneath his flannel shirt as he looked up from the log he was splitting. Across the clearing, near the darker tree line where the shadows lingered longer, a small shape stood still. A bear cub. It was no larger than a medium-sized dog, its fur matted with early frost, eyes round and unmoving. It didn't growl or run. It just watched. Eli straightened slowly, his hand tightening on the axe handle. He didn't make any sudden moves. After a few long moments, the cub blinked, then turned and slipped back into the trees, leaving nothing behind but a few paw prints in the snow. That night, Eli sat by the fire longer than usual, thinking about what he'd seen. A cub alone was unusual. If the mother was nearby, she would have made her presence known, and forcefully. The thought of an orphaned animal troubled him more than he expected. He poured himself a second cup of coffee and sat in the darkness, listening to the crackle of the fire, wondering if he'd imagined it. The next morning, Eli returned to the same clearing. He worked slower this time, his eyes scanning the tree line as he chopped. And there it was again. Watching. No closer than before, but this time the cub stayed longer. Its dark eyes followed each movement Eli made. When the sun crept higher into the sky and Eli packed up to return home, the cub was still there, unmoving. It became a ritual. Every morning for the next week, the cub appeared. Always at a distance, always silent. Eli stopped checking for it after a few days, because he knew it would be there. Somehow, its presence became a part of the forest rhythm, just like the wind through the pines or the crows that circled above the dead branches. Eli began leaving scraps of food on a low stump in the center of the clearing, bits of bread, dried meat, once even a piece of salted fish. He never saw the cub approach the food. But by the next morning, the stump was always bare. He didn't speak to the animal. Didn't try to lure it closer. He understood, in a way he couldn't explain, that the silence was part of their understanding. Then one morning, Eli reached the clearing and realized something was different again. The cub wasn't watching from the tree line anymore. It was closer. Much closer. Sitting beside the stump, its round ears perked forward, a leaf stuck to its snout. It was waiting. And so was the beginning of something neither of them expected, a bond neither man nor beast had sought, but both seemed to need. Eli had never meant to feed a bear. It was dangerous, he knew. Everyone in the village had stories, wild tales of foolish tourists who treated wild animals like pets and paid dearly for it. But this was different. The cub hadn't demanded anything. It hadn't come close with growls or aggression. It had only watched. And waited. And now, it was trusting. When Eli stepped into the clearing that morning and saw the bear cub sitting next to the stump, the one where he always left scraps, his boots paused mid-step. The cub didn't flinch. Its black eyes followed him as he moved carefully, like he was walking on frozen glass. He kept his axe strapped across his back, though he didn't touch it. Eli reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slice of dried apple. He gently placed it on the stump and stepped back. The cub didn't move at first. Then slowly, it inched forward on padded feet and sniffed. It glanced up at him once, as if asking permission, then took the apple in its mouth and backed away. That was the first real exchange. Over the next few days, Eli noticed details about the cub he hadn't seen before. It had a small nick in one ear, likely from a scrape with a branch or another animal. Its left paw favored slightly when it walked, and sometimes it wheezed when breathing after bounding through deeper snow. Signs of struggle. Of survival. Of loss. One snowy evening, back at the cabin, Eli sat by the fire and stared into the flames. He thought of the photo on the mantel, his wife Marin, smiling in the garden they once kept. And of the silence that had swallowed him when she passed. The cub, he realized, reminded him of something painfully familiar. Being left behind. It wasn't long before Eli began speaking to the cub, not in full sentences at first, just gruff remarks and muttered greetings. "Morning," he'd say as he entered the clearing. "Snow's thick today. You still hungry, little shadow?" The cub never responded, of course. But it listened. And somehow, Eli could tell it understood. Maybe not the words, but the feeling. By the second week, Eli gave it a name. Koda. A word he remembered from an old storybook, meaning friend or little bear. It suited him. "Koda," he said softly one morning, as the cub sat waiting near the stump. "That's what I'll call you." The cub blinked slowly, as if in agreement. As the days turned to weeks, the two of them fell into a rhythm. Eli would chop wood while Koda watched. Sometimes the bear would wander a bit, sniffing trees, pawing at snow, or rolling in a drift, but he always returned to the stump before Eli left. On warmer afternoons, Koda would lie on his side and nap in the sun while Eli worked. The man would steal glances, a small smile tugging at his weathered face. For the first time in years, Eli didn't feel completely alone in the world. One day, Eli noticed something strange. As he swung his axe into a thick log, Koda, now larger and stronger, mimicked his motion from the edge of the clearing. He rose on his hind legs and swiped at a tree branch, then dropped to all fours and watched. Eli chuckled. "Trying to learn a trade, are you?" The bear tilted his head. From that day on, every time Eli lifted the axe, Koda would rise and imitate the motion in some comical way. It became their shared language. A ritual that had no real meaning, yet meant everything. And then one morning, Eli made a decision. He left the axe at home. He walked into the forest with only his gloves and a small hatchet for marking. He wouldn't be cutting wood that day. Koda was already at the stump when he arrived. When he saw Eli's empty hands, he huffed softly and tilted his head in confusion. Eli crouched a few feet away and pulled an apple from his coat. "No work today, bud," he said. "Just you and me." The cub approached, closer than ever, and sat down beside him. And for the first time, Eli reached out a hand. Not to feed. Not to warn. Just to be near. Koda leaned gently into the touch, and something passed between them, an unspoken promise, ancient and pure. They were no longer strangers in the same woods. They were companions. Spring melted into summer, and with it, the bond between Eli and Koda grew deeper and stranger. Wordlessly, steadily, the bear cub and the solitary woodcutter became something no one would have believed if they'd seen it with their own eyes. Each morning, Koda would be waiting, not just near the stump now, but walking alongside the path as if he'd anticipated Eli's footsteps. Eli took to humming old folk songs during his morning walk, and sometimes, he'd catch Koda huffing or growling in rhythm, like a child trying to sing along without knowing the words. Eli would laugh. He hadn't laughed like that in years. Their days followed a peaceful ritual. Eli chopped wood while Koda lay nearby, watching with relaxed interest or swatting lazily at butterflies drifting through the clearing. Sometimes, Koda would bring a large branch or log between his teeth and drop it beside Eli, his own strange way of helping. "Thanks," Eli would mutter, wiping his brow. "Didn't know I hired an apprentice." Koda would chuff, his black eyes gleaming with a light that seemed amused. As the cub grew, so did his courage. He began approaching the cabin's edge, cautiously at first. Eli never coaxed him closer. He simply sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, allowing Koda to decide the pace. One morning, Koda surprised him by climbing the porch steps and lying across the wood planks like a family dog. His head rested inches from Eli's worn boots. Eli didn't move. He just sat, heart thudding gently, staring at the bear who had once watched him from the trees. The same bear who now trusted him enough to fall asleep within arm's reach. The villagers, of course, started whispering. They'd heard rumors of a woodcutter who had tamed a bear. "Reckless," one said. "Madness," another scoffed. "He'll be mauled before winter." Eli didn't listen. He had no reason to prove them wrong. Koda wasn't a pet. He wasn't a trained animal. He was Koda, a spirit of the woods who had chosen, for reasons Eli would never fully understand, to walk beside a man burdened with loneliness. They needed each other. That was enough. One afternoon, something unusual happened. Eli tripped while hauling a heavy pile of logs. His knee gave out beneath him, and he hit the ground hard with a grunt. Koda, watching from nearby, let out a short growl and rushed over. Eli braced himself, thinking instinct might take over, that the bear might panic at the sudden movement. Instead, Koda nudged Eli's arm gently with his snout, then lowered himself beside him protectively. He didn't move until Eli sat up and gave him a slow pat on the head. "You really are something, you know that?" Eli whispered. Koda just blinked, calm, steady, loyal. The turning point came in the late summer. A forest fire broke out nearly 10 miles north of the valley. The winds carried smoke to the cabin, filling the mornings with a faint haze. Wildlife began moving through the lower forest in confusion. One day, Eli woke to find a deer standing just yards from his front door, wide-eyed and trembling. He stepped outside, half expecting Koda to be there too, but the bear was nowhere in sight. Panic twisted Eli's stomach. He searched the trails, called softly into the woods, "Koda? Koda boy." But nothing stirred. Just smoke and wind. But at dusk, just as Eli returned to his cabin, a heavy shape appeared from the mist. Koda emerged, singed slightly at the tips of his fur, leading a small group of frightened raccoons and a fox kit down the slope. He paused in front of the cabin as if to say, they needed help. "I brought them here." Eli was stunned. The bear had guided other animals to safety, just like a shepherd. After that, the villagers stopped whispering. They started watching. One evening, Eli left the axe by the cabin door and walked into the woods empty-handed. Koda followed beside him, step for step. They didn't need words. They didn't need leashes, or ropes, or rules. All they needed was the trail, the silence, and the unspoken trust that had replaced Eli's loneliness with something warm and wild. As fireflies flickered through the pine branches and the sun dipped low, Eli turned to his friend. "You know," he said, "you saved me long before I ever saved you." Koda gave a low rumbling breath, almost a sigh. And somewhere deep in the forest, a bond that couldn't be explained, simply was. The forest was too quiet. Eli knew something was wrong the moment he stepped onto the trail that morning. There was no birdsong. No wind brushing through the pines. No heavy crunch of paw prints behind him. No Koda. He reached the clearing and paused beside the old stump, the one where their friendship had begun months ago. The stump was untouched. The nearby grass, usually flattened where Koda liked to nap in the sun, stood tall and unbothered. "Koda," he called softly. "You out there, boy?" Only silence answered him. It sank into his chest like cold water. He waited all day, chopping nothing, doing nothing. Just listening. Watching. Hoping. But the bear never came. At first, Eli convinced himself it was nothing. Maybe Koda had wandered farther for food. Bears were wild, after all. Even if he'd become a friend, a companion, Koda was still a creature of instinct, not obligation. "He'll be back tomorrow," Eli told himself that night, stoking the fire a little longer than usual. "Bears don't vanish. He knows where I am." But morning came. And then another. Still no Koda. The days grew longer, painfully long. Each sunrise brought dread instead of peace. Each trip to the clearing was quieter than the last. Eli began leaving food again, little bits of jerky, dried apples, untouched, day after day. The villagers noticed his unease. Clara, the old baker's daughter, even asked him gently, "You haven't seen the bear lately, have you?" Eli only shook his head. "Maybe he's moved on," she offered. "They do that, don't they?" He didn't answer. Because he knew in his bones, Koda hadn't moved on. Something had happened. On the 7th day, Eli stopped chopping altogether. Instead, he began to search. He started with the trails they used to walk together. Then moved deeper into the trees, beyond where he'd ever dared go before. He found broken branches. Tracks, some fresh, some old. He followed them all, hope clinging to every print like a fragile thread. Then came the 8th morning. It rained hard the night before, and the woods smelled of wet moss and rot. Eli trudged toward the river bend where he and Koda once sat watching beavers build their dam. There in the soft mud he saw it. A large paw print, clear, sunken, and unmistakable. Then another. Then nothing. Just drag marks leading into the underbrush. Followed by blood. Eli's throat tightened. The prints were too far from the den Koda had used weeks ago. The drag marks, they weren't the scuffle of a play fight. Something had taken Koda. Or injured him. Or worse. Near a cluster of ferns, Eli found a rusted metal tooth trap, broken, bent nearly in half, its edges bloodied. Fury surged through him. He had warned the hunters before, told them not to leave illegal traps in these woods. They never listened. And now his only friend may have paid the price. That night, Eli didn't go home. He lit a fire right there in the clearing. Sat beside it until the stars blinked through the branches. He whispered into the night like a prayer. "You hear me, Koda? I'm not leaving you. Not again." But only the wind answered. And the forest remained silent. Eli couldn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the blood on the trap, the drag marks into the underbrush, the silence that followed. His heart, once so used to solitude, now twisted with worry and guilt. He had promised to protect the cub, the friend, who had trusted him. And now Koda was out there, hurt or worse, and Eli had no idea where to look. The next morning, he left before dawn with nothing but his coat, a satchel of dried food, a hunting knife, and the broken trap wrapped in burlap. Not for protection, but for a message. He started by visiting the ranger station at the edge of the valley. "I want to report illegal trapping," he said firmly, dropping the bloodied metal on the table. The ranger, a sharp-eyed woman named Riley, raised a brow. "Where did you find this?" Eli hesitated, then admitted, "Near my clearing. A bear cub's gone missing. He's injured. Bad." She studied him. "You're the man who lives with the bear." Eli didn't answer. "I've heard the stories," she said. Didn't believe them. Until now. With her help, a search was organized. Quiet. Unofficial. A few trusted conservation workers, no rifles, just tranquilizers, first aid kits and bait. They combed the woods, checking every hollow, cave, and thicket for signs of movement. Days passed. Nothing. But Eli refused to give up. It was on the fourth night that something strange happened. Eli returned to his cabin, exhausted and cold, and found something resting on his porch. A stone. Not just any stone, one from the old riverbank near the clearing. On its surface, faint claw marks scratched a curved line. A familiar shape. A symbol. Eli stared at it for a long time. Then he turned and followed his instincts. He walked all night, no lantern, no guide, letting his memory and heart guide him. By dawn, he reached the old logging trail near the base of the western ridge. A place he hadn't walked in years. And there, beneath a fallen tree, he saw movement. A massive shape. Breathing heavily. Covered in dirt, dried blood, and tangled weeds. Koda. The bear didn't rise. He barely lifted his head. But when Eli dropped to his knees, Koda opened his eyes. And for the first time in weeks, Eli heard the faintest sound. A huff. Not of fear. Of recognition. "You stubborn brute," Eli whispered, voice breaking. "You came back." Koda had been hiding. Not out of fear, but instinct. Wounded animals withdrew, but he had left signs. A claw scratch here. A paw mark there. As if trying to lead Eli without drawing predators or hunters. The stone was no accident. The bear had remembered their place. Riley and the rehab team arrived within hours. They sedated Koda and treated his wounds on site before moving him gently to the wildlife center for recovery. "You know," she said to Eli, "he's lucky to have you." Eli looked at Koda, bandaged but alive. "No," he replied. "I'm lucky to have him." And for the first time in weeks, something shifted in the air. Not just relief. Hope. The kind that returns when something lost is finally found. Spring came late that year. The snow took its time melting, clinging stubbornly to the roots of the pines and the creaky boards of Eli's porch. But beneath it all, the ground was waking. Life was stirring again. So was Eli. Every morning, he walked to the old clearing by the stump, just like before. Sometimes he brought food. Sometimes he just stood in silence. The wind in the trees, the smell of pine and ash, it all reminded him of when it had started. The stump was still there. The tracks were long gone. But Eli kept coming. Waiting. Koda had recovered slowly under the care of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The injuries had run deep: torn muscle, infection, nerve damage in the paw. They weren't sure he'd make it through the first week. But the bear had fight. And when he'd opened his eyes again after the first treatment, the only thing he did was look toward the door. "He's looking for you," Riley told Eli when he visited. "We've never seen an animal this attached to a human before. Not like this." "He's not just an animal," Eli said quietly. "He's Koda." The decision to release him had been complicated. There were laws, after all. Regulations. Fears. But even the most skeptical rangers had seen the way Koda reacted to Eli's voice. How he calmed when he stood nearby. How he stopped limping when he heard Eli call his name. "You want to take him back?" Riley asked one day, standing with a clipboard beside the fenced enclosure. Eli watched the bear roll in the grass like a lazy dog. "No," he said. "I want him to go where he chooses to go." So they made a plan. They'd release Koda near the far ridge, not too close to the cabin, but not too far. If he wanted to return, he would. No cages. No tracking collars. Just trust. The same trust that had built this bond in the first place. 2 weeks later, the gate opened. Koda stepped out slowly into the tall grass, sniffing the air. He didn't look back. But Eli understood. It was up to him now. Days passed. No sign of him. Then a week. Eli didn't panic this time. He didn't assume the worst. He simply waited, patient, like the trees that surrounded his cabin. Some things took time. Healing. Decisions. Goodbyes. Then one night, just as dusk crept over the treetops and painted the snow silver, Eli heard a sound on the porch. A thud. Then a low huff. He opened the door. There stood Koda, larger than ever, his fur thick and glossy, his eyes alert. A faint scar still crossed his paw. But he was whole. Alive. In his mouth, he carried something gently, Eli's old work glove. He dropped it on the porch, then sat down like he belonged there. Like he never left. Eli stepped forward, slow, tears stinging his eyes. "Welcome home," he whispered. Koda responded with a low, rumbling breath, familiar. Soft. The man sat beside him, like he used to at the stump. No words were needed. Not now. Everything between them had already been said, through silence, through storms, through time. And so the man who once lived alone, and the bear who once watched from the shadows, found each other again. Not out of chance. Not out of need. But out of something deeper, a loyalty that defied logic, a friendship that belonged only to the wild. And this time, there would be no more goodbyes. Just the sound of footsteps, one pair heavy, one pair soft, returning, side by side, into the forest where it all began.